My name is Domingo Paes. I am a Portuguese merchant. And in the year 1520, I walked through what I believe to be the greatest city on the face of this earth. The Vijayanagara Empire was founded in 1336 in southern India. By the time I arrived, it controlled the entire southern tip of the subcontinent. Its king, Krishnadevaraya, was so feared that neighbouring kingdoms sent him gifts simply to stay on his good side. Trade routes connected the city to Arabia, Persia, Portugal, and China. This was an empire at the absolute peak of its power, and its capital was built to show the world exactly that. Now let us enter it. As I approached Vijayanagara, the first thing I saw was the wall. Not a wall, walls. A whole series of enclosing fortifications stretching out across the landscape for miles in every direction. These were not simple barriers. They were massive stone structures running across hills and through valleys, following the natural shape of the land, turning the terrain itself into part of the defence. And it was not just the walls. Between the outer and inner rings of fortification, the land had been deliberately cleared and shaped. Thorny thickets and dense bush were cultivated in certain passes and approaches, making it almost impossible for an enemy cavalry charge to gather any speed or momentum. I had spent enough time around soldiers and horse traders to understand immediately what I was looking at. This city had been designed to stop an army dead before it ever reached the gates. The outer defences alone enclosed an area so enormous that entire towns and farms existed within them. Fields of grain, orchards, livestock, wells. The city could feed itself for years without a single supply cart entering from outside. No enemy could break this place by force. No army could starve it out. Vijayanagara had been built not just to be magnificent, but to be untouchable. And with that first sight behind me, I began to walk the road inward toward the city itself. The road between the outer settlements and the city was unlike any road I had travelled before. It was wide enough for many men to walk side by side without crowding. On either side, large trees had been planted at regular intervals, their branches reaching over the road and forming a canopy of shade that made the walk bearable even under the full heat of the Indian sun. But the road itself was not what struck me most. It was what was on it. The road was never empty, not at any hour. Soldiers marched in columns. Merchants moved in both directions, with carts piled high with goods. Pilgrims walked in bare feet, carrying offerings. Porters balanced enormous loads on their heads. Ox carts groaned under the weight of grain sacks. There were rest houses and wells built along the road at regular intervals for travellers to stop and recover. The empire had invested heavily in this road because everything depended on it. Every village I passed through was another node in a network of supply and trade that kept the city alive. And then, as I rounded a hill and the tree line broke open before me, I saw the city for the first time. There are no words in Portuguese that do justice to that moment. It spread across the landscape in every direction, filling valleys, climbing hillsides, disappearing into the distance further than the eye could follow. It is as large as Rome, I thought to myself. No, larger, far larger. I passed through the inner gate, and the city swallowed me whole. Inside the gate, the first thing that hit me was the noise. The roar of 10,000 voices, the creak of cartwheels, the clang of metal on metal, the call of vendors, all of it washing over me at once as I stepped into the great merchant street. This street ran straight and long through the heart of the city, and it was so wide that several of the grander streets of Lisbon could have fit inside it side by side. On both sides, as far as the eye could follow, were shops and stalls and covered market spaces of every kind. The merchants sold everything. Cotton cloths woven so finely they felt like water between the fingers. Spices I had no names for. Silk, iron tools, copper vessels, painted pottery. Carved wooden objects. Sweet-smelling sandalwood stacked in bundles. And then, deeper into the market, I found the gem dealers. I had handled precious stones before. I was a trader. I knew what rubies and sapphires and emeralds looked like, but nothing I had seen before compared to this. Merchants sat directly on the ground, with their wares spread before them on plain cotton cloths. No locked cabinets, no guards standing over them. Just men sitting cross-legged in the open street with diamonds, rubies, emeralds and pearls piled in front of them like grain. I saw one merchant with a heap of rubies before him so large I could not have lifted it with both hands. The wealth sitting openly on that single street on that single afternoon was beyond anything I could calculate. And the people of Vijayanagara walked past it without a second glance. For them, this was simply what the market looked like on an ordinary day. I pulled myself away from that market and continued deeper into the city, where something far grander was waiting. The Virupaksha Temple announced itself before I even saw it. The sound reached me first: drums, bells, the low hum of chanting rolling out through the streets from somewhere ahead. Then the towers appeared above the roofline. Enormous stone gateways, called gopuras, rising so high above everything around them that they seemed to belong to a different scale of construction entirely. Their surfaces were covered from base to peak in carved figures. Gods, demons, celestial creatures, warriors, animals, hundreds of figures layered upon each other in dense, intricate relief climbing upward toward the sky. I passed through the main gateway and entered a courtyard so large that the far wall was almost lost in the haze of incense, smoke, and distance. The courtyard was alive. Priests moved in procession carrying oil lamps. Pilgrims prostrated themselves on the stone floor before burning sacred fires. Vendors sold flowers and offerings near the entrance. The sound of bells rang out at irregular intervals from shrines scattered across the complex, each ring answered by another from somewhere else in the courtyard. The halls of columns were what stopped me completely. Each column was carved from floor to ceiling with figures and scenes in such precise and intricate detail that I spent the better part of an hour standing before a single pillar. Animals frozen mid-movement, warriors locked in battle, dancers caught in poses of impossible elegance. Every surface of every column told a story, and the hall contained dozens of them stretching back into shadow. The smell of burning oil and incense filled the air so completely that it stayed on my clothes for days afterward. When I finally pulled myself away from the temple complex, I was directed toward the palace. The palace complex was enclosed within its own set of high walls, a fortress sitting inside the fortress of the city itself. Passing through its gates, I entered a world of wide-open courtyards, ceremonial platforms, long colonnaded halls, stables, armories, and the great residential buildings of the royal court. The scale of it was immense. It would have taken a full day to walk through every part of it properly. The structure that drew the eye immediately upon entering was the platform they called the Mahanavami Dibba, the House of Victory. It was a massive tiered stone platform, rising level upon level above the courtyard floor like a great stepped stage. Its outer walls on every side were covered from ground to top with carved stone panels. Processions of soldiers, elephants in full battle armor, hunting scenes, celebrations, the armies and victories and ceremonies of the Vijayanagara Empire carved in continuous detail around every face of the structure. It was the history of the empire made permanent in stone. I was told that during the great festival of Mahanavami, the king himself would sit at the very top of this platform. Below him, in the vast courtyard, thousands upon thousands of spectators would gather. Nobles and generals would approach to offer tribute. Soldiers would parade in formation. Elephants with painted faces and decorated armor would process before the crowd. Horses in gold-trimmed harness. Dancers and musicians. The entire spectacle would continue for 9 consecutive days without pause. Standing alone in that empty courtyard, looking up at the top of that platform, I tried to imagine the king seated there, looking down over it all. An empire stretching across all of southern India laid out before him, and every person in that courtyard knowing it. When the time came to leave, I walked back out through the streets slowly. I passed again through the merchants' quarter, the sound of trading rising and falling around me. I walked the great royal road one last time, past the pilgrims and the soldiers and the ox carts. I looked back at the towers of the Virupaksha Temple until they disappeared behind the buildings, and I wrote in my diary that this city was the best provided city in the world, that it was stocked with provisions of every kind to a greater extent than any other city I had ever seen, that its streets were full of goods from every corner of the known world, and that its king was the most feared and most perfect king that could possibly exist. Every word of it I meant, and every word of it was true. Vijayanagara, the greatest city on earth, in the year 1520. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe so you do not miss the next story.